Well, I think that's probably good to make a start. So good afternoon all. My name's Tanya Fosdick. I'm Research Director at Agilysys, and I'm joined by Dr. Elizabeth Box, who's here from ECM Research Solutions. So yeah, quite a grand title this afternoon, Cracking the Code on Motorcycle Safety. Are we going to solve it all this afternoon? Let's have a look. But we're definitely going to talk about the role of data research and evaluation with really unpicking this challenge for road safety, which many of you will be familiar with. So what we're going to do this afternoon is talk through a particular project that we've been working on and which we did present in a very, very condensed format a few weeks ago at the RSGB Motorcycle Conference. So what we'd like to do this afternoon is take a little bit more time to talk through some of that data research and the evaluation element of it. And then also kind of unpick what we found at the conference, because those themes about data and research really did come up time and time again throughout the day. So if you were there, great, hopefully we can kind of explore some of those themes with you. But if you weren't, then hopefully this is a really good way of kind of catching up and understanding what we learned in that session back a few weeks ago. We have a Q&A facility at the top. I don't know, let me see if anybody has popped anything in there. No, we've just got an afternoon in the chat. If you do have any questions as we're going through, please, if you could use the Q&A facility, it just makes it a little bit easier for understanding specific questions as opposed to some conversations that you may well have between yourselves in the chat facility. So let's, without further ado, go a little bit further into this. So why is motorcycle safety so important? So these are just some numbers from 2023 here in Great Britain. So 315 fatalities in that year is equivalent to filling 12 buses. We had 5,481 serious injuries, and that's enough to fill a small town. And then 11,182 slight injuries. So that's more than the capacity of a sold out arena. This really does matter. We've had a falling in motorcycle casualties from 2014 to 2020, but since then we've started to see an increase again. And so we really do need to continue to focus on this road user group. As it says here, each level tells a story. Each number represents a rider and a family and a community who are impacted. So Liz and I have been working together for a little while now, well over a year actually, time flies, hey, on this particular project for national highways. And I believe Amanda is in the room. So thank you very much, Amanda Hornby, for sponsoring this work and working with us on this. So this particular piece of work is aligning with National Highways' commitment that no one should be harmed on their network, and that motorcyclists are a priority group for them. And they do have a specific performance indicator, which is about reducing KSIs for non-motorised and motorised motorcycle casualties on the SRN. So this particular report here, which you can access via that QR code and is available on the National Highways website, takes you to a project which we did, kind of this time last year, exploring from a data perspective and from an evidence perspective how people are involved in casualties as motorcycle users, and what might we do to start to reduce that risk, and what does best practice tell us, and also how we might evaluate it. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time now taking you through the crash data. Then I'm going to hand over to Liz to talk through what the literature review we undertook found and how we might start to develop a logic model related to these particular road user groups. Then I'm going to come back and have a look at some of the interventions that are currently being delivered in the UK. Liz is then going to talk about evaluation and the next steps with this particular piece of work. And then we'll have a bit of a reflection and kind of how that aligns with what we saw at the motorcycle conference a few weeks ago. And then invite you all to ask us questions in relation to what we've been doing. So let's start with some of this crash data. So we were looking at 5 years worth of data for English roads specifically. as many of you will know, National Highways leads the English Strategic Road Network. So we were specifically interested on what's going on English roads, not just the Strategic Road Network, but also the rest of England's network as well. So looking at all casualties, severities here, we've got nearly 50,000 collisions which were involving motorcycles up to 125cc and 30,000 involving motorcycles over 125cc. So whilst we've got larger numbers for those smaller machines, actually we have a much higher severity ratio for larger vehicles, larger motorcycles. So 44% of over 125cc's resulted in death or serious injury, compared to a quarter of those on the smaller bikes. So given that we've got two kind of different motorcyclists or machines, we decided to split up the analysis, and that report with the QR code has got quite a lot of in-depth detail in there. I'm not going to go through it all this afternoon because, yeah, we probably could take up at least the hour, if not more. So I just want to summarise a little bit of what we found. So those on those smaller motorcycles tended to be on local urban roads, certainly not on the strategic road network. They were on A roads, tended to be single carriageways, and 20 and 30 mile an hour roads. Where these riders were on faster roads, they were more frequently KSIs. A quarter of them didn't impact with another vehicle, as you can see here. A third occurred at T junctions, and another third occurred away from junctions. Probably not a huge amount of surprise here for many of you. In terms of who the casualty was, they tended to be injured themselves, so were not hurting another party, but they were often either involved in a collision with a car or with no other vehicles, so that they impacted something else individually. And over half of them were travelling straight ahead. Now, interestingly, or perhaps not surprisingly, actually many of these casualties were from London. And so we ended up doing some more in-depth socio-demographic analysis, looking at those from London and those elsewhere. Probably the nature of delivery riding and courier riding, commuting, meant that some of these motorcyclists are around the capital. Tended to be male and young, and actually the KSIs were even more likely to be 16 to 24-year-olds. There was a slightly different pattern from those who were from London, so they tended to be a little bit older, but not significantly. They were still majority under 35, as you can see in this chart. So we ended up looking at their ACORN profiles. So ACORN is a socio-demographic profiling system. And so we could look at those who are on smaller bikes, particularly from London, because actually they did have quite different profiles to some of those outside of London. So we've got four ACORN groups here, which are overrepresented amongst the London casualties. So the tenant living, which is the orange one here, tended to be 18 to 34 years old, degree educated, but making ends meet, privately renting. Then the blue lot here, the blue screen, crash-strapped families, again 18 to 34, GCSE educated, tending to be a little bit more struggling in terms of income, social renting. Then we have the purple group, metropolitan surroundings. These were a little bit older, so 18 to 45-year-olds, degree educated, comfortable in terms of their incomes, privately renting, and actually likely to have young children. And then the final group on this page are urban diversity. So again, 18 to 44 years old, A-level educated, having young children. They are making ends meet, and they live in ethnically diverse areas. So what we've got here is four very different groups of casualty from London who are involved in crashes on small bikes. This does mean that one size fits all isn't going to work here. Some might be commuting on motorcycles, some might be in the gig economy, others might be using their bike to get to college or university. So it does mean that we have to think about our interventions and these different audiences. For those outside of London, slightly different profiles and a little bit older, actually. So the hard up households, 25 to 49, So they might be the child, you're a child of these people, or the rider themselves, given that younger profile. They do tend to be GCSE educated, just about making ends meet. Family renters, again, that's slightly older profile. So are we looking at the parents of a 16, 17, 18-year-old here? Again, A-level educated, making ends meet and renting. The limited budgets and the cash-strapped families were two of the ones in the London group. So I think what's interesting from those outside of London, deprivation is starting to be a little bit more of an issue. So this could be influencing the equipment that they're purchasing, the type of bike, where they got it from, and also the training that they might be undertaking if they're struggling with income. So moving on to those on over 125 cc's. Again, they tend to be on local roads, not necessarily on the SRN, but what we've got here is a greater split between urban and rural roads. So they're either on 30 miles an hour or on 60 mile an hour roads. Again, many more KSIs on faster roads. A quarter of them did not impact with another vehicle, a third occurred at T junctions, and more than a third occurred away from junctions. Again, the casualty tended to be themselves in a collision with a car or no other vehicle. Again, travelling style. I've got a feeling these bullets might not be quite right, actually, because that sounds like the same as the other one. I'm going to skip over that. But what we have got is some more ACORN profiles. And again, I'm not quite sure if these are correct, just looking at yes, sorry. So these ones, yeah, there's a real mix of backgrounds with the ACORN from outside of London. So there's much less deprivation involved with those on larger bikes. Again, I'm not quite sure if there's a mistake with the slides here, so I'm not going to go into the details, but it's all in the report if you go and have a look at those. And at that point, I'm going to hand it over to Liz, I think, to talk through the literature and intervention review.
Thanks very much. And just I can see there's a couple of comments in the chat about a couple of people not being able to see the presentation. So I'm sure Steve or Nathan will be able to have a look at that. And I'm not quite sure why some would be able to and some not. But yeah, if you're having problems, do put it down there and we'll see if we can try and help you out. So lovely to see you all this afternoon. What I'm going to be talking through now, as Tanya said, was as well as doing the data analysis as part of this work, what was really nice about this piece of work that National Highways commissioned was they wanted to also understand about what the international literature was telling us about motorcycle riders as well, not just looking at our available data, but also then looking at what delivery was looking like in the UK. So it's a really nice study that kind of looks at it from multiple different angles, which has helped us kind of piece together what looks like best practice in this area. So I'm just going to be talking to you now about the literature review that was done and also outline something around the intervention review that was done as well. So really what we wanted to understand was what was the current provision of motorcycle training in Great Britain. We did this through collecting knowledge from the research team ourselves, also sector level experts, key searches across websites, and really what we wanted to do was evaluate those studies or what was being delivered for their quality, relevance and their outcomes related to what we were looking at as part of this work. And we also wanted to understand how that was done and also what their limitations might be in terms of the literature. And also what we wanted to do was map it across the Goals for Rider Education Matrix. I'm sure many of you on the call are very familiar with the Goals for Driver Education Matrix as well, but essentially it's a matrix that looks at, are we looking at sort of basic physical skills and training, or are we looking at higher order skills, things like self-assessment, self-control, self-regulation, life skills. So where were the existing post-licensure interventions and what were they trying to target? So that was a focus of our work. You'll have to click on, Tanya. I think I've got multiple clicks in here, so thank you. As well, we wanted to look at the published literature. So we wanted to look at the last 10 years. That's always a kind of a good span of time over the last decade to see what's new and relevant here. And we wanted to take the literature from countries that were relevant. There was a huge amount of power two-wheeler research that's been done in Asia, but what we wanted to do was look at comparable countries to ourselves. So obviously elsewhere in Europe, Australia, North America, etc. But there's clearly a lot of work going on around the world in this particular area. We use some key search terms, which you'll see in the full report. So if you wanted to recreate any of it, you should be able to go back and see exactly what we found. And we looked across a number of key databases that we were able to search. And what we wanted to do is assess whether they were relevant in terms of their quality, and also whether they were relevant in terms of the particular topic that we were looking at, which was behavioural and educational approaches towards post-licensure training. So that was kind of the method that we took. Next slide, please, Tanya. And essentially, it can all be boiled down into a couple of bullet points, really, which I guess is helpful for us being able to digest it, but you always kind of hope you might be able to find a little bit more nuance on there. But essentially, and I'm sure many of you won't be surprised by this, we found that there was a lack of conclusive evidence around the effectiveness of motorcycle training, particularly in reducing crashes, injuries, or collisions. If you click forward, Tanya, I think there's probably something else on the screen there as well. And this wasn't because we often say that this is the case. This is not to say that it's not having the effect. It's just we don't currently have really good quality evaluations to really understand what those impacts were, which is really disappointing when you look internationally, and that's also the case. So I suppose we can look at it in one way, that we are no different to our international counterparts, but also that we all need to improve in terms of what we're doing with regards to evaluation. So we also had a little bit of a look at, okay, we're looking at post-licensure, but does some of the literature tell us anything about the pre-licensure world? And that showed that there were obviously some mild to moderate effects. You'd hope so, because that is actually at that real kind of key skill point that you're trying to have that input. But it was the non-compulsory post-licensure training, which was the focus of this particular work, that seemed to be ineffective due to that sort of poor study quality and limited data as well. Okay, next slide. And the other thing that we found as well is that there were a couple of what's called systematic reviews, and these are really high quality evidence, because essentially they take many other studies that are good quality studies that don't have any biases in them and that are well referenced in evidence, and take them all together to understand what that's telling us about things. So they're often the ones that it's worthwhile having a look at what those kind of key results are. And there was one, well, there was a couple actually of reviews that kind of looked at advanced rider courses, looking at those higher order skills that I mentioned in the GDE or GRE framework. So things like hazard perception. And essentially that was a very consistent message that came out of the international literature, was that hazard perception and hazard prediction training was actually helping to improve safe riding behaviours. But again, it was very difficult to know whether that was having an effect on the road, beyond the simulator, actually out there, because they didn't necessarily have those safety outcomes. And we also, the other systematic review in this area found that you know, for post-licensure rider coaching programs, particularly for newly licensed riders, they had some short-term improvements in hazard anticipation, but they had no long-term effects on crashes. So again, a very similar finding there. So we really need to kind of improve that evidence base, because what we're not getting at the moment is understanding, is it affecting crash reductions? And we really need those more detailed evaluation metrics to be able to understand what those effects are. So in terms of, you know, kind of the key findings from the work, unsurprisingly, as I've already said, it felt like hazard perception, and that's a big recommendation that has come out of the report, in that it does seem to improve that hazard identification, but not necessarily consistently across all rider groups. So as Tanya was talking about, the importance of segmenting who you're focusing on and what their particular needs is quite important. And then when we're thinking about what does that mean with regards to training and design, what we recommended within the report, based on what we found, was there was potential for on-road and classroom-based training combined. Often what you find is, if you have multiple ways of portraying this information and getting that message across, that's a bit more effective, because it also allows for things like self-reflection, engagement with peers, etc. So that there's that, not just doing one or the other, but doing them combined, and also having those hazard perception and decision-making skills training. This is actually considered as cognitive training skills, and actually we can all get better at this, and it can improve the situation as well. And in terms of kind of where we go forwards, it's, as already discussed, we need to kind of get those different training components in and focus on the different skills and abilities of different rider groups as well. So as Tanya mentioned, part of the report was to take what we knew about the data, take what we knew about the international literature and also what was happening locally. And I know Tanya's going to talk through kind of how all this relates to what we're currently seeing happening in the UK context. But what we wanted to do was take an example of, okay, given this is what we know, if we were to design an intervention from scratch for a specific group or particular risk type, what would it look like? So this is an example, and I'll go through this in much more detail than we were able to do at the national conference. So this was for segment 5 and 6 that are in the report. So this is essentially single vehicle rural collisions involving large motorcycles. So, and this could be at junctions or away from junctions. So that was for the specific group that fell into that category. And what we said within that logic model is we were able to identify who they were, what their common media outlets were, what were good communication channels, and then we'll work through the process of, okay, well, if you were to have an intervention, what would be the inputs, what would the immediate impact be, and where eventually would those health outcomes come from. So as you can see in the inputs, what we suggested based on what we found was that you'd want to have some really targeted safe rider training sessions, potentially using some co-creation workshops to really understand what those user groups needed, using social media campaigns to go through those common media outlets, and actually having sort of community engagement activities. So those are the sorts of things that you'd put into the mix. And what you'd hope would be the immediate output or the immediate impact of doing some of that is delivering assets that improved particularly situational awareness, decision making, and adherence to safe or defensive riding practices. So those were the 3 kind of key areas that we felt would be really useful to focus on, given what we found in the evidence. And then you kind of break that down a bit more and say, well, what would the evidence of that be in the short term? So if we wanted to measure, if we delivered that and we wanted to focus on that as our aim, what could we see as the difference? And essentially this was about, is there increased awareness of the risks, particularly of riding large motorcycles in rural settings, speed management and how people are managing that particular issue, about their hazard perception, road positioning, and also understanding other drivers' limitations and behaviours. That's also really important, that we focus on not just the rider themselves, but the environment within which they're working. And then kind of looking a bit further on, you might find those initial kind of impacts, but what would you really want as the behavioural impacts? And what we outlined here was around a heightened sense of responsibility for their own and others' safety, better road positioning, more appropriate speed choices for the conditions that they're within, and the consistent use of safety equipment and enhanced rider skills, and then leading to obviously the ultimate health outcome, which obviously is very difficult to measure. And as I've already said, is something that's a big limitation in a lot of the international studies. And as you can see, I won't go through all of the detail, but as you can see, the sort of section down really kind of chunks down what are the aims and objectives of what you'd need to achieve, who the target audience would be, which kind of falls back to all the things that Tanya was talking about in terms of those ACOM profiles. And then what would you need to do to design it? So we use the COMBI method here to look at the capability, opportunity, and motivation focuses. So, for instance, the physical was around those defensive rider skills, having that psychological understanding of the risks of riding large motorcycles on rural roads. And then how does that feed through into what we would expect riders to do differently, when, where, and who with would they need to do that differently? And then importantly, this is why it's so important to have these logic models, is at the outcome level, you're able to have some measures to see whether it's having any effect. So this can be things like knowledge, what their behaviour is related to safe riding, their attitudes, their commitments to this sort of thing, their intentions towards safe riding, their plans, whether they feel they have any sort of control over it, and also their social norms and what they think that other important people in their life are doing or thinking about those particular issues. So I think we wanted to include, we had a couple of different logic models in the report, but really to illustrate how it's useful to sort of map through what the evidence says, how that would influence an intervention, and then how you would measure it at the end.
Great, thank you. Actually, what I didn't say in the collision analysis section is, whilst we had the larger and smaller motorcycle engine groups to begin with, actually when we ploughed down into the data and looked at the circumstances of different crashes, we did end up with 7 different segments. So as Liz said, this is the logic model for segments 5 and 6. But what we realised is that not only are the engine size, but the types of crash, the environment in which they crash, means that we've got lots and lots of different types of problem with motorcyclists per se. So we can't look at them in the whole. We've got to understand the different issues that these different groups are facing and tailor accordingly. So yes, much more we do urge you to have a look at the report because much more detail in there. So as Liz said, we also looked at kind of what was being delivered already in the UK, because we wanted to see how what's being delivered on the ground right now aligns with what we found in that evidence review and in the collision statistics. So we identified 20 interventions which were specifically related to post-licensure training. We sure there's many more out there, but this is what was identified in our searches and from going out to places like the RSGB Knowledge Centre to ask for information. So yes, we identified 20 broad spectrum of different approaches. Interestingly, 11 of them were national schemes, with 9 of them being local to a particular region. And we had a variety of different approaches. So these are all post-license, as we say. Some of them were on-road training and assessment. Others were online education versus in-person education. We obviously have some options for diversion from prosecution. We've got campaigns and we've got workshops. So there are a huge range of different motorcycle licensing education and training. The purpose of all of them tended to be similar. So we've got physical skills here, knowledge, attitudes, and cognitive skills. And then a real range in terms of delivery. So some of them were as short as 1 hour, others took up to 4 days to complete. As Liz said a little while ago, what we did was map those 20 interventions against the goals for rider education. So it's a similar matrix to the goals for driver education, and it works up rather from basic vehicle control and kind of looking at knowledge and skills, all the way up to personal characteristics and ambitions, competencies being a really key part of the intervention, and things like self-evaluation. So how do we reflect on our skills and our behaviour, etc. So the numbers won't mean anything for you guys without looking at the report. What they do is categorise, link to our descriptions within the report of each of these different interventions. But as you can see here, we've picked out a couple which are of interest. So NRAC is the National Rider Risk. Hold on, need to remember what NRAC stands for.
Awareness course, is it?
It's awareness course, I think it is. Yeah, should know that as being involved in the Road Safety Trust. Oops. But yeah, that's one which is a diversion from prosecution specifically for motorcyclists. So that is up in the top, where people are being really asked to reflect on their own attitudes, their ambitions, their characteristics, and their behaviour. Interestingly, the advanced motorcycle training offered by ROSPA, which is one of the longer training schemes, on-road training and skills schemes, is also up there. But interestingly, the cornering advice, which is a shorter, smaller scheme, is just about vehicle control and giving knowledge and skills. So you can see within this table how there's a wide range of different levels according to the goals for rider education. Now, we looked at whether or not any of these interventions had been evaluated. So 4 of them had been. So the Advanced Rider scheme delivered by the IAM RoadSmart found that those who'd been on the course had safer attitudes and reported fewer collisions per mile than a comparison group. Then Bike Attack, which is National Highways campaign, found that over 50% of their respondents reported a behaviour change after engaging with Bike Attack, and it made much positive perceptions amongst those who had engaged with it. Then we've got the Know the Dangers, which is by the Shiny Side Up campaign. So this was about social media campaign, and this achieved significant reach with engaging content. And then Road Safety Scotland's Live Fast, Die Old. So they found reported positive behaviour change with 94% of those engaged in the evaluation reporting changes which surpassed the campaign's target. However, there were some limitations with the evaluation approach. So we've got with these particular ones within our sample. Many of them were process, which is about, did the delivery of the intervention go as planned? Many of them were about reporting awareness of the campaign or of the materials. A lot of them were self-reported, and many of them were post-test only, so that we didn't have a before stage to be able to analyse what the changes were. There are also other limitations here. So we've, subjective bias in self-reporting. If people are, responding to questionnaires and looking at, how their attitudes, we can have introduced bias into this. People, pleasing the researcher, etc. So pre-intervention data is really important, and we're not necessarily focusing on outcomes here. So what we were really talking about within the report is how do we engage in more robust experimental designs in order to validate findings. Some of these interventions, many of them are voluntary. They are self-selecting audience. So how do we get round the issues of being able to control for what would happen if we gave these interventions to a random sample of motorcyclists? Would we be able to shape effectiveness, identify effectiveness accordingly? So I think I'm handing back to you now, Liz, to talk about the role of evaluation.
Yes, and I think I'm probably going to test whether our systems are working. When you shared the presentation, did you share it with sound, do you know, Tanya? Because there was a video here which I just think really explains the Nesta standards of evidence quite well, probably better than I could do. But I think the real question here, just whilst Tanya's working out if that's a possibility, if not, I'll talk through it, is that there are other areas of intervention design and public policy that are taking approaches that we need to apply essentially in road safety, and the Nesta standard of evidence is a really good example of that. Do you know if we can share the video, Tanya?
I can give it a go. I can't see if I've got the settings enabled right now, but shall we give it a go and see?
Give it a go. If we can't hear it, I'll narrate it.
You may need to. Oh.
Okay, great, thanks for that. I think maybe that didn't work for some people and it worked for others. Teams is a weird place, isn't it? Sometimes things work and it's difficult to work out quite well how. But I think what the real challenge is for us here is that we must, I would say as a sector, at least try and make sure that what we're delivering meets that level 1 standard, which is, do we have a really good theory of change for what we're doing? So can we explain whether we're using evidence, data, how we're actually designing an intervention and why we think it's going to be effective? Are we building on something that's been done before? And really setting that out in the logic model kind of approach is quite a nice way of doing it. Helps us understand what we're really trying to do. And then, as described in that video, for those that were able to hear it, we kind of move up those levels in terms of understanding, well, if we're doing something, can we measure a change at all? To start with, it's great just to collect some data to see if there's a change there. And then later up on sort of level 3, you'd be looking at running controlled studies, so you can understand, well, is this change? Is this something we can isolate from what's happening elsewhere? And I think level 5, we do have some examples of level 5 interventions in the UK, and that's really the ones that UK ROED run, in that they are run nationally, they're evaluated independently, they are checked to see if they're running consistently. So you have different trainers who've been trained to deliver them, and they get checked on those. So we do have some really good examples in the UK of really high quality interventions that are checked. Obviously, not everyone runs in that same way, and we need to kind of adjust for what we're doing. But I think that's a really good process to be thinking of, and it might be worth you thinking of what you're running locally and where you would currently fit in that level scale. The QR code, it should take you through to the document on the Nesta website, which kind of outlines all of that sort of approach. And we were talking about this the other day, weren't we, Tanya? I think we've both been doing a bit of decorating recently, having both moved house recently. But I was just thinking that it's interesting, isn't it, with intervention design process, that first bit of, I don't know, stripping the wallpaper, sandpapering, filling cracks, all that pre-work that we know nobody's ever going to see, but is actually really important to the final outcome. It's painful, isn't it, to do that? And often we think, can we skip doing this? Are we really going to notice in that end outcome if this work is done? And often we know, oh yes, the paint's peeling because I didn't actually get that last bit of glue off. So I think it's quite a nice analogy that we need to do that pre-work in the intervention design process. We need to understand the audience, which is all about the data that Tanya was talking about, understand that sort of behavioural diagnosis approach. COMBI is a great method for using that. Do we need to focus on capability, opportunity, motivation, and actually planning out what we're going to do? And then when we move to that next step, it's the implementation. I think often we're really good at doing this. I think I chose that picture specifically because it feels like the pretty satisfying bit, the actual delivery. You actually got something out there that people are engaging with, and it's often the exciting part. And that's actually, you know, I think we're really good at doing that, but I think it's one part of a 4-step process. The other bit being evaluation, which we're talking about today. So once it's done, is it actually meeting our needs? Are there any gaps that we need to fill? And then finally, do we need to iterate? Do we need to start again? Do we need to build on what we've done? So there's lots of stages, isn't there, to intervention design? And I think we probably focus overly on that one. I can understand why we all do it. It is the really engaging one, but we need to make sure that we're going through that whole process. And in the report that we produced for National Highways at the back, we wanted to, so saying it at the back, it sounds like a small addition. It wasn't actually, it was a big chapter within it, but we wanted to outline what does kind of good look like, and giving some sort of working examples for this as well. So as you'll see in that diagram, it kind of works through, you know, what are your aims and objectives? How are you getting your evidence to work out what matters, through to analysis and reporting. And importantly, I would urge you to go and have a look at the full report, because what we try and do is separate out the outcome evaluation and process evaluation. So as Tanya was saying, process evaluation is very much about understanding, was something delivered how you thought it would be? That's considered the fidelity of an intervention. As I was saying, UK ROED, they're always trying to understand, are our trainers delivering this in the same way, in the same standard to everybody? So that's a really important measure to have. How much of the thing was delivered? How was it received by the people that received it? Did they enjoy it? Did they engage with it? We need to know whether people enjoy, engage with something, because that does have an impact on its output and its outcome, but it is also not the outcome at the same time. What percentage of people did it reach? Did we recruit the right people? And what was the context? What's the barriers and facilitators? So process evaluations are really, really important to understand why something might or might not have worked, but it doesn't tell us if it does actually work or not. What we need to do when we're evaluating is have these outcome measures. So I've got some examples on the screen. There's others in the reports which kind of outline, if we're thinking about a theory of planned behaviour, we might want to measure people's intentions, their attitudes, whether they feel like they have any sense of control over their behaviours, and also what their social norms are. And what's included on the slide there is some validated survey instruments that have been tested and trialled with the audience before. I think often there's a temptation, let's make up our own surveys, and from an academic sense, there's quite a lot that goes into making up a survey instrument. You would kind of want to understand, well, what construct are we looking to measure? And then you'd kind of do some sort of, it's a statistical process where you kind of cluster whether it actually meets what you're looking at in the first place. Then you need to understand, is it consistent? Is it consistently measuring what we're interested in? And you'd need to run that with at least 100 people to understand, is it measuring what I think it's measuring? So I guess the upshot is, and it's something I've always done, I've never set out and done my own surveys. I've always used work that others have done, because they've gone through that full process, and there's lots of good ones out there to use. So we've got some good examples in the report. So the case is, do borrow from the good work of others. We don't all need to start from scratch all the time. And as a case study example of that, there's a couple of case studies in the report showing studies that others have run, what the survey instruments they've used, and you might be able to find something that might be useful for your work going forwards. So in terms of the next steps, National Highways have funded a follow-on piece of work that we're doing, well, Agilicis, myself and TRL are running. And it's really nice to kind of take forward the initial findings of that report into actually working through, well, actually, what does that mean for intervention refinement and evaluation going forwards? We have two candidate examples that we're using within the report. So National Highways' own Biker Tech programme is looking at doing some refinements based on the evidence, which we're working on with them. And also ROSPA as well is looking at developing a specific course looking at the equivalent of what their level 2 driver programme is for motorcyclists too, so using the evidence base. And importantly, the next step after the intervention refinement is around actually running the evaluations. So Agilicis and myself, we've been much more involved in the upfront research and iteration of the programmes of work. TRL are involved with the evaluation. So participant recruitment, data collection, and working with partners to roll those studies out and evaluate them as well. And we thought, as part of the project team, it was really important to separate out the evaluation from the creation, because again, it's not good practice really to evaluate your own work. So it was really important to have that, even though we are obviously one team, but we've got different elements within the project. So that will be running through to 2026, and we're looking forward to sharing the findings of that. And thanks again to Amanda and Victoria at National Highways for really championing kind of taking this approach forward and doing some demonstration projects, which hopefully will help others kind of look at how they could maybe take some of those approaches forward in their own work.
Great. And we said we were going to reflect on the RSVB motorcycle conference and how that aligns with the work that we've been doing. So when we got together the other day to kind of pull together these slides, I think we agreed that actually there's a huge amount of activity. It was a very packed day, wasn't it? Many presentations that seemed to have to get shorter and shorter as the day progressed, because there was just so much which was going on. And I think one of my big reflections was the amount of national coordination. So we had the likes of the National Fire Chiefs Council there, police representatives, Bike Safe, Biker Down, the National Young Riders Forum. And I think one of the things I found really encouraging there was the amount of, let's come together and deliver a scheme well as a collective, rather than reinvent our own things in different counties, because we've had that in many, many different spheres of road safety, haven't we, where we've got our own different flavours. It makes it really difficult to evaluate, to look at a local level. But just having some of that national consistency allows us to get economies of scale and produce a better product. There was also an awful lot of focus on behavioural interventions. And I think one of my reflections from the day was actually thinking about kind of safe system approaches. There was probably less on the wider systemic approach than perhaps on focusing on the motorcyclists themselves. We also had an awful lot of talk about data segmentation, which was amazing, because everything we've just said at the beginning of this conversation about one size not fitting all was very much reflected in the presentations that we saw at the conference. So we had interventions and discussions, research based on understanding the challenges for the gig economy. Then a separate ones looking at leisure riders or young motorcyclists or offender riders. So this idea that we can't just have one size fits all really did come across, and I felt was really very positive. But we did have a lack of evaluation on many of the interventions. So the ones that listed here are the ones where we have got some really good data and evidence. And I do know that some of the other projects that were being discussed are kind of midway through evaluation. But it would be really good if we could kind of embed those evaluative processes into everything that we're doing, so that it's not just about being built on a really sound evidence-based at the beginning, thinking about that decorating analogy. It's not just the prep work, it's the other end of actually standing back and, is this the right color? Have we done a good job here? Are those lines straight? Not if I've got the paintbrush in my hand. So yeah, I think we've got to really make sure that we do more of that. And yeah, we were discussing as well a little bit of reflection. I don't know, Liz, if you wanted to come in here specifically on that, some of the framing could be better, could be improved with some of those interventions.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, going back to that analogy, lots of the prep work seems to be there now for some of these programs. It's great to see, but sometimes I was quite surprised, and there was one particular one at the conference, but I've had this before where you see the prep work is really good, you've got the behavioural science, you've got everything there, and then we end up with a intervention that's very similar to stuff that we've done before, sort of framed as, the collision incidents, the emotional effects, etc., which we know from the evidence is not necessarily the most effective way to go. And sometimes it's a bit surprising that we've ended up there, given that we've kind of started from the evidence base. Sometimes it feels like we've maybe watered down things a little bit just to try and kind of move things in a slightly different direction, but without going completely different. So yeah, I think there's still a challenge there. And maybe we just need more examples of what different looks like, because sometimes once you've kind of gone a certain route, it's very difficult to know, well, actually, how do we address this in a way that's going to be effective and is framed in a way that's going to engage with that audience. And I think we've all got a long way to go in making sure we get that right, but we're moving in the right direction. I think it was a really positive day, wasn't it?
Definitely. We've definitely got one question in the Q&A, and I think it's I'm going to go on to this next slide, which is kind of a bit more of an open discussion, but please do get your questions across for the last 10 minutes. So Carla's asked, it would be good to apply the Tyre project and its approaches to gig economy riders in London. Is that a possibility? Now, I'm not sure that it is a possibility to kind of lift what we're doing directly in that project, but Liz, do you have any specific thoughts on the approach that we've taken that could be applied to other motorcycle groups in specific areas? And can we use the methodology to all of this to help with gig economies in particular, gig economy riders?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. And I saw in the general chat that people were also talking about, gig economy riders, particularly in London, and how that's, completely dramatically changing the landscape that we're all facing. And we often see that out on the roads quite consistently ourselves as just individuals. Absolutely, you're right, Tanya, that the approach that we've taken here in terms of what does the evidence say, who is the specific target group we need to focus on, what's going to resonate with them, how do we deliver, it's all transplantable to different situations. There has been, I was involved with some gig economy work that was part of the policing review work that was done. So have done an evidence review on the gig economy. We know that the likes of Nicola Christie's done a lot of work recently on gig riders and the influences there. So there's some useful research in the space. We also did develop some sort of 360 videos as well, which I think are available for use now. They haven't actually, this is the problem. I think as a project, it was sort of focusing on the creation, and then there hasn't been the evaluation. It was kind of promised that eventually there would be some evaluation. Obviously, there's always good reasons why that doesn't end up happening. So we don't know whether those are effective yet, but there's certainly some work that I've done and been involved in that's done that, and I guess we need to sort of try and share that better and get that evaluation done to understand if we need to iterate before rolling out a bit further.
Yeah, I mean, I think just kind of going back to what we're doing in this current project, given that we found 7 different segments, we had to really focus in on what we knew about particular ones, because we couldn't solve every single, there's so many diverse pressures and influences on these crashes that it would have ended up being too generic an intervention if we tried to address all 7. So I think the gig economy in London is a really different group to what we're looking at now with the ones we're doing, but the principles are very much sound, and yeah, all works. Axel has just popped in another question. So, can looking at vehicle data help our understanding of safe, unsafe riding behaviour, hazardous situations, or road layouts? So, there's been lots done for cars around looking at harsh braking. Oh, interesting question. I would imagine yes, if we can get hold of the vehicle data. I believe much of the kind of connected vehicle data that we work with, particularly in Agilicis, is car related. I don't know how good the access to motorcycle specific information is. Probably one to follow up on. I don't know.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think ultimately, as you said, Tanya, and it's probably not, certainly not my area of expertise, but undoubtedly the answer would be yes. And you just reflect on the amount of data that we get in other vehicles. Even if research studies, just thinking particularly in the States, massive naturalistic studies of understanding what's happening with drivers and a huge amount of data for researchers to interrogate. We don't have any of that for, motorcyclists. So obviously there must be technology out there that is providing that, but whether we have access to do the research, I'm not aware that we do. So yeah, it feels like hopefully we can move that way eventually, but we don't have it at the moment, do we? Daniel also noted there was another question, I think, in the chat section, which bringing up, I think, your point around we definitely need some up-to-date guidance for designers, network maintenance, and for the environment, so taking on board the safety system approach for when things go wrong. So obviously we focused a lot, again, on post-test training, because that's really the focus of this particular piece of work. And I know that you acknowledge that that's obviously one part of the whole picture, and what we need to do on that. I know you're doing work on that front yourselves, aren't you?
Yes, it's big passionate piece of mine that we do need that Swiss cheese layer, layers of protection within the safe system in order to stop things ending up in death or serious injury when things go wrong. So I think that was probably, as I said earlier, one of my frustrations with the motorcycle conference, is that there was this focus on the road users themselves. We had no conversation about safe speeds with motorcycles. Possibly a bit of a potentially thorny conversation. We did talk about PPE and the benefits of wearing good and having good vehicle equipment. I think there's probably more that we could do thinking about safety systems on motorcycles, but also on other vehicles to detect motorcycles and to mitigate conflict between them. There were definitely some conversations about integrating good road design to help motorcyclists within strategies, local planning strategies, and a couple of presentations which were talking about how they're not as seen as important as, say, pedestrians or cyclists, and therefore authorities are not necessarily designing to protect motorcyclists. So from a systemic approach, we definitely need to do a little bit better here. So we've got a few more minutes. Liz, is there any particular ones on these questions on our slides whilst we wait for anybody else to come through that we wanted to talk about in particular? Is there can we answer any of these questions on the slide?
We should be able to answer the questions we posed, I suppose, shouldn't we? Yeah, I mean, I suppose the one I put there about, is there a perception that doing something is better than waiting for rigorous evaluation? I mean, in the real world, we know that doing evaluation and work from start to finish takes a long time. The project that we're doing for National Highways, it's going to be taken until 2026 before we have the outcomes from that, because we've got to recruit, we've got to run the study, we've got to do the analysis. And I can understand that sometimes there's an impatience of a feeling that if we're not doing something, that there's a dereliction of duty there as well. So yeah, I guess there's a general question of is that a sticking point sometimes, and do we need to do a better job at sharing those resources that we do have that have been evaluated that people can run with, or is there a sort of a medium term option whilst we're waiting for something? Well, there's always going to be something better, isn't there? We've always got to improve from what we've got now. So yeah, but that's probably a question to people that aren't able to answer back necessarily.
Well, maybe not, although Ruth does mention the fact that BikeSafe has now joined forces with UK Road, and would it be good to review any previous research on BikeSafe? I think this is a general plea, actually, of we reviewed the interventions that we could find details on out there. We found 4 that were evaluated. I think there's probably more than 4 that have been evaluated, but that the evaluations are not necessarily in the public domain, or are potentially not as rigorous as they could be. Therefore, we've really got to kind of share anything, because I think if we're sharing results that are not necessarily as positive as we would like them to be, actually it's a real positive for us as a community to know what isn't necessarily working as well as it could be. And it could be that the evaluation wasn't as robust in terms of design as we would like it to be. Again, that's a real positive to know, because we're still understanding the failings in the research. And so I think my forever plea to everybody is just let's make sure that we've got whatever we're learning about our interventions out there, so that we as a community can continue to learn and progress and refine, because it allows us to understand where those research gaps are.
Yeah, absolutely. No results are bad results. They
Exactly.
give us a direction of travel, and there's always limitations for whatever we do. But yeah, as you say, important to get that out there.
And an observation by James now. I've just been looking at Stats 19 on severity by type of motorcycle manoeuvre on motorways. Very informative about general severity and severity by type of manoeuvre. Ooh, that sounds very interesting. And if you did want to drop me a line and share anything that you've been doing there, I would be really interested to see what work you've been doing, because yeah, aggregating by different vehicle type and vehicle maneuvers and location to understand what risk are. Yeah, risk is all about helping us to inform and refine our interventions.
Yeah, almost. I think what would be the next useful step to add to the work that we've done is that in-depth collision investigation, to kind of provide that additional kind of system level understanding of what's happening at those collisions that have been identified by the data. So yeah, it's gradually piecing that jigsaw together, isn't it?
And I've just looked at the time, and we have 1 minute left. Anybody got a last minute quick question that they can quickly tap in, or any final reflections from you, Liz?
No, I don't think any additional for me, apart from, well, I don't think we changed our slides that much from the motorcycle conference, and it took us 45 minutes to go through it, and I think we had 10 minutes, did we, on the day?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, yeah, thanks to you guys for giving us some time to talk through that. I think it's been important, because I think hopefully it's a really useful report for the sector, because it's got the evidence, it's got the data, and it's also got something in there about evaluation. So yeah, it's good to be able to talk about it in more detail.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Liz. And thank you, Nathan, for the prompt for next Monday. So it's the data visualization workshop. So hopefully many of you will be able to attend for that. Again, thank you very much for all joining us this afternoon. I hope you did find it interesting. Please do go and have a look at the report. Feel free to contact us if you have any questions or supporting work. This is something we're really passionate about, and hopefully we can all help to further the knowledge base around this particular road user group. Thank you all again, and take care, and yeah, hope to see you all soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.